This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Adam Audio, Isotope, Native Instruments, and Grace Design. You're hearing my voice right now through the Grace Design M201 Mark II mic preamp into the Empirical Labs EL8X distressor mixed through Isotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar, all on Adam Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the links in the show notes. It's a great way to help support this show, and we really appreciate it. Now, get ready to rock.
To me, the most creatively crippling thing is the concept that anything goes. Oh, well, what are we? Are we an Americana band? Are we a synth pop band? Are we a folk band? Are we a rock band? That kind of stuff needs to happen before mics are put up. I love that, and I think it forces everybody to really kind of double down on the decision that there are rules, and that anything goes really is just going to be chasing your tail over and over and over again.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. No matter what style of music you create, Native Instruments provides you all the instruments you need, from drums, loops, and beats to vintage and modern synthesizers, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I really enjoy recording real bands in my studio, but then adding amazing overdubs from Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Battery, Guitar Rig, or Hybrid keys. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off or get complete start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples at nativeinstruments.com. Are you struggling to make your mixes sound professional? If your tracks feel weak, distant, or lack punch and clarity, I've got the perfect solution. My free course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will teach you how to achieve pro-level mixes from your home studio using free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. But these techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you use Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or another. If you're ready to make your best record ever, go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started now for free. Find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Howdy, Rockstars. It's your host, Lij Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Steven Lee Tracy, a writer, musician, producer, mixer, and owner of Saint Cecilia Studios in Tucson, Arizona. Steven works with a variety of artists from electronic pop, big modern vocals, to indie rock bands, to Americana acoustic music, and all sorts of things in between. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the ways that he can interact with so many different artists to bring out the best in their work. Saint Cecilia Studios looks like a really cool location too. And this episode is particularly interesting to me because Saint Cecilia is also the patron saint of music. And Cecelia is also the name that I gave to my one-of-a-kind famous MCI console, originally from Criteria Studio C in Miami, that I had here in my studio for 15 years. This is the console that recorded Hotel California for the Eagles, the Bee Gees, Stayin' Alive, and Saturday Night Fever. Margaritaville were an American band, and the Grease soundtrack, to name just a few. A big shout out and a thank you to Björgvin Benediktsson at Audio Issues and Matt Boudreau at Working Class Audio for making our introduction. So please welcome Steven Lee Tracy to Recording Studio Rockstar. Steven, are you ready to rock, dude? So tell us a little bit about yourself, man. I mean, that was a very brief intro. Give us a bit of an introduction in your own words to who you are, and give us kind of the brief arc from getting interested in music to having a fabulous looking studio in Tucson.
Well, I probably am 10 years behind everybody that typically has this story. I didn't really listen to music growing up. The house I grew up in was pretty conservative. We weren't allowed to listen to modern music or anything. And so I got kind of a late start on that. But once that switch got flipped, it just continued at about as quick of a pace as I could get. I just couldn't get enough. I just kind of absorbed it. I felt like I had a lot of time to make up for.
Yeah.
So bought a guitar, started writing songs, played in some terrible bands, moved to Seattle from where I grew up in Tucson, where I lived for about 10 years. Got an internship at a studio there and started my own room in the C room of that studio.
Was it Jackpot?
No, that's in Portland. Although
in Portland. Sorry.
I love Jackpot.
Sorry, Larry. Not too far away.
At the time, yeah, it was, no, not all 3 hours. It's in Seattle. The studio was at the time called Ironwood. Now it's called Avast. It's one of those
great
legendary rooms. It is, with an exclamation point. Yeah, it's a terrific room. It's kind of one of those legacy rooms that has all the Seattle records on the wall from, the last few decades. Anyway, started in the C room, just doing my own thing with a business partner, and we produced records, started writing songs. I spent the next 10 years playing in a band on the road, and we got a record deal, and that was that for a while. But I continued to produce when I wasn't on tour. And then at some point, I got tired of living in a van or a bus or an airplane, and just started doing this full time and started kind of doubling down on studio world. And yeah.
Right on. Did you spend much time sort of with an acoustic guitar or mostly electric and doing the band thing?
I started out with an acoustic guitar. It's one of those where the strings were like an inch and a half off the fretboard.
Sure, yeah.
Like everybody's first acoustic. But almost immediately, I just started buying other instruments. I realized I wasn't interested in being sort of virtuosic or proficient in just one thing. I was more interested in sort of a conductor role than a first chair role.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like I played guitar at the band I was in. I played guitar and keys live, various other things in the studio. And now I kind of play a variety of different things. I just kind of like the zoomed out perspective more than the really isolated one.
Did you, if you grew up sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Protected from music. Did you have any exposure to learning any instruments, or was that all part of the brand new breaking out into discovering music and discovering how to play instruments all at once?
Yep, it was that. I think at some point, maybe I had, I played hot cross buns on the piano next to a teacher or something, but it wasn't permanent. It was maybe a few lessons. It just started teaching myself, watching a lot of videos, just hanging out with a lot of people that were way further along than I was. Yeah. And just kind of learned that way.
So your time in Seattle was what decade?
That would have been in the 2000s.
2000s. Okay, great. So like at this point, the great Seattle boom is a decade-old story.
Yes.
Nirvana and all that stuff.
It had sort of migrated from things like the grungy stuff, Soundgarden and Pearl Jam, to like Death Cab for Cutie and things that were more on the kind of indie side of things.
Yeah.
That transition was starting to happen pretty significantly.
Well, and then, when I think of Death Cab for Cutie, I'm also thinking of artists that build studios to make their records. In Nirvana's time, it probably seemed like the solution was still you had to go into a commercial studio to record. But with Death Cab for Cutie, it's probably a lot more like, hey, maybe we can just really have a cool setup. I remember, apologies on not having the artist name, but I recorded those guys in my Bonnaroo studio, and I remember he poked his head in afterwards, and he was like, "Oh, what kind of gear you got?" So I know they're particularly interested in the whole home studio scene.
Absolutely, that was the first time that, like, when I was in the bigger studio, there were two huge rooms there was two Neve consoles, giant 1,200 square foot tracking rooms, but our room, the C room, was just 300 square feet. We would do all the big stuff when we needed to in the big rooms, and then just drag the drive over to our room and get started on overdubs and mixing. And that was my first introduction to like, oh, you don't have to rent out Capitol Studios for a month and spend $1 zillion. There's ways to do this a little more efficiently.
Yeah, right. And of course, now here we are, and everybody's can basically have an incredibly powerful studio right in their house, no matter
For sure.
right with a laptop,
No question.
Well, so talk a little bit about doing the band thing. So it was post-studio that you did the band thing, or it was just before the Seattle studio?
It was just before I'd moved to Seattle to do studio work and to double down in that world. And about 2 years after I moved there, we got offered a record deal, and that just became the new focus.
Yeah. And did you do the home studio thing at that point, or did you just go into studios?
We did it both. We had our own room, so we would do the big stuff, drums and stuff in other rooms, and then come back and finish overdubs in our they were decent home recordings. Like, we had a few nice preamps, a few nice mics, enough to do overdubs, but it was still pretty modest.
Yeah.
We kind of did the combo.
Did you guys use Pro Tools, or did you use something else?
When I learned on Pro Tools, and then for some reason, I think I'm trying to remember why, I used Digital Performer for about 3 or 4 years.
That was a thing. Then. I knew some people that took Digital Performer for quite a long run before they might have even switched.
Yeah, the MIDI at the time was leaps and bounds beyond Pro Tools MIDI. And that was certainly some of the draw. There was always some drum programming and MIDI things happening in the music we were working on. And that was a helpful tool. But at some point, I'd switch over to Pro Tools just because it was simpler, just to be able to, take a drive, pop into any room, pretty much anywhere, and be able to just get to work right away.
I think Digital Performer was my first one, actually, too, when I started my home studio. When I got my first interface and set up at home, it was Digital Performer with some kind of interface. And then shortly after that, it was the Digio one for Pro Tools.
Oh, yeah.
And that changed so much, because all of a sudden you could have a low latency, 16-track setup at home. So funny. That sounds so limiting now, but it's really not. I mean, just being able to record yourself.
Oh, yeah. Now that you just said that, it reminds me that part of the motivation for Digital Performer was, at the time, Pro Tools was a native. You had to have either one of their Digi interfaces that were somewhat limited, or the full-on HD thing. There wasn't really a middle ground at the time.
Right, exactly. I forgot that for a moment, too. And you're exactly right. That's why I got the Performer one, and that's why when the Digio one came along, it was like all of a sudden it was possible. And I can't remember. I think it was later that the M-Box made an appearance, which was really opened up the world of possibilities for people with laptops and all that.
It did. I remember not being able to do Beat Detective on more than a stereo track, things like that were now seem like, I don't know how in the world I would even navigate that at all.
Yeah, really.
But yeah, when they went native, that just made it an easy decision to kind of go back to what I learned on.
Well, at least you're lucky to start out with Beat Detective. I mean, we just had to go in and manually chop every single hit on the drums and then scoot them over by hand to the grid and then re-crossfade them. It would take a full 8-hour day of editing just to go through the drums for one song. Just to see how it sounded,
I can't even imagine having the patience to do that.
Yeah, we had to use a lot of patience for things. I remember I've mentioned this before, but the artist I was working with, it was something, Dr. something Pitch and Time, I think was what it was called. It's been so long since we used it, but that was the only one that they really liked the sound of the algorithm. And so in order to use it, I had to go in and this is if we were going to tune vocals, I had to draw by hand the pitch of what we wanted it to do. And so I'd have to figure out what was the vocal doing. Was it going sharp and then flat? And so I'd have to draw it flat and then sharp. And it would also take me 8 hours of going word by word through a vocal, trying to draw it back.
Was there a piano roll or something next to it so you could see the note?
No, I actually hooked up my strobe tuner to Pro Tools and I would play, if you do shift and spacebar, I could play back each vocal sound at half speed. So everything sounded like a cow, like moaning out in the field. It was like, and I'd watch the tuner go up and down, and I would draw the opposite line until the tuner just looked straight through the whole note and then move on to the next note. It was the most ridiculous thing ever.
That is wild. Thank God for Melodyne and all the things we have now.
Yeah, really. Yeah, it was a lot faster now, that's for sure. And then, eventually you're just like, hey, what happens if we just don't use any of this, just perform it?
Yeah.
But that's cool, man. So you did the band thing. And, also I think of the 2000s as a time when the labels were still, it felt like the labels were fading out with, the big money throw at independent bands and stuff like that. Although
For sure.
It probably still happens in just a whole different way these days, depending on what you're into and where you are.
We had the first label we were on, we got bought out of, and we had one of those big shot manager moments where they're throwing around big numbers. And at the end of the day, the deal didn't happen. I'm really glad, because in retrospect, we were historically stuck between nobody's buying physical merchandise or physical media, and streaming wasn't really in yet. It was kind of that no man's land prior to Spotify and Tidal and all that.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad, because we were just owed an enormous amount of money they're just advancing.
Right. You guys
you pay back.
You had gotten it in advance, and now you were just sort of indebted to the label.
Yeah. It's funny now looking back on the budgets. Like, I think the last budget for the last record we did was $80,000, which now seems like such an enormous amount of money to make a record.
Yeah.
At the time, that was getting spent on things like hotels and various things, not just studio time. But if somebody came to me, is like, hey, I need to make a record. I need to do it for $65K. I'd be like, okay, we can make that happen.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it's just a different time.
We can make your whole career for $65K.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. And of course, the expense of going into big commercial studios and like camping out for ages was significant. And, I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's very cool now that you can have a really nice commercial studio, but you go in with the intention of being very efficient in your time use.
Yes.
And then you can still go back to another studio. With all those things said, I mean, I do think it's an interesting combo. I mean, when I had my mentor, Brad Jones, back on the podcast recently, he has a studio called Alex the Great where I started, and it's somewhere in between. It's like it was a studio that was first there because of ADATs, which was sort of the early home studio access to building a studio. Yet it also had enough space for them to host a band, and a band could sleep there if they wanted. And, he talked about the intention of having an artist come in for 2 weeks straight, and it's just like you just do everything. And I have to say, I love making records that way when you get a chance to do it, just like buckle down and stay focused. How often do you get to do a record now where it's start to finish on the record versus doing some, coming back, doing some more, et cetera?
I'd say it's mostly the doing some, coming back. I think one of the first conversations I have with folks, though, is like, let's immediately box this project in and put some rules into place, put some deadlines in place. Because part of the benefit of doing those kind of location recordings where you're there and it's like, okay, we have 3 weeks to make a record, and at the end of that third week, we're done because the tour's booked and we're heading out or whatever it is. There's a psychological benefit to that where you're making decisions efficiently and you're committing to things as you go, where if there's just this kind of open-ended timeline, you can really get in the weeds. So even if they are going to be, coming in fits and starts over a period of a few months, I still like to box it in as if, okay, these are the 2 days we have right now. This is part of this ultimate timeline. And even though it's broken up, I try to treat it similarly to get the benefit of those decision-making.
Atom Audio celebrates 25 years of designing industry-leading monitors in Berlin by unveiling the Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a limited time. With the XART ribbon tweeter design, customizable speaker voicings, and SonarWorks integration for room correction, these monitors deliver professional-grade sound perfect for Grammy-winning producers and home studios. Make your studio cooler than cool with the Arctic White A4V and A7V, available for a limited time with the standard extended 5-year warranty at adamaudio.com. So that reminds me of something that I talk about sometimes, which is just the importance of having boundaries in order to create art. You know, if you think about a painting, an oil painting in a museum, there's sort of a simple and classic concept of a frame, a stretched piece of canvas, and it's so big, it's 2x4 or whatever, or a poster design, and here those are the boundaries. And it's like you have to have boundaries in order to make the art sometimes, maybe all the time, And in record making, it could be something as simple as we've got 8 tracks, or we've got 2 weeks, or we've got this group of musicians to work with. Talk more about that idea, because I do think that's important. But at the same time, I also would suggest that the boundaries have to be legit. They can't just be bullshit or made up necessarily.
100%.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, like to me, the most creatively crippling thing is the concept that anything goes. It's like, oh, well, what are we? Are we an Americana band? Are we a synth pop band? Are we a folk band? Are we a rock band? That kind of stuff needs to happen before mics are put up. And it's like, what are we doing? Like, where are we heading? What are the rules of this project? Is it sounding super modern? Is it supposed to sound throwback and vintage? If it's supposed to sound throwback and vintage, what are we ruling out? Let's rule out stuff that's, super modern, that's, technology that didn't exist in the era we're trying to live within. I love that. And I think it forces everybody to really have to kind of double down on the decision that there are rules, and that anything goes really is just going to be chasing your tail over and over and over again.
Does anything come to mind for you about a moment where there weren't enough boundaries and you had to sort of like guide the ship to the compass?
Yes.
That was a little sailing reference based on your Avast Studios.
I got it. I got you. Yeah, there's this. When I lived in Atlanta for about 3 years, and I worked at this studio there called Glow in the Dark. And there was a guy that there's, I don't know, 3 or 4 producers that worked out of there. And there's a guy that made his rounds at various points through all the producers, and he would bring his song like, hey, I just want to get your take on this. And he'd been working on this batch of music for probably years at this point, 4, 5, 6 years. And every version was different. There was the folk version, there was the synth pop version, there was the heavy rock version. And he just had no sense of kind of where he was going with it. And at that point, I wish I would have said, like, I'm not the guy for this, because I don't know if you're interested in completing this. I think you just enjoy the process, which is fine, but that is not my thing. I need there to be a finish line.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can understand that. I mean, I think we all have some version of that, some version of the challenge of moving forward with our own personal creativity and like hitting the finish line somehow. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's important for us to recognize those things. It's like, are you trying to make something that gets finished and that goes out there and moves to the next rung on the ladder of this musical journey? Or are you just doing something because it's a self-exploration of, different sounds and different colors on the palette? And that's legit too, but it's good to know which one you're doing.
It really is. And I love that very first conversation with artists about, so what are you? And if you don't know, give me some direction as to like what you're shooting for. And somebody might say, well, I wrote these songs on acoustic. It's like, well, you're a folk artist? And I'm like, no, that's just all I know. I really love Churches, or I really love Arcade Fire, or whatever it is. And it's like, oh, well, we can do that. Maybe there's no acoustic on this entire album. But
Yeah.
they may not have a sense of that just because they're sort of bound to how they wrote the song and what that is. But it's such a great opportunity just to get to know them, to hear like what it is they're looking to do, to help them get there is just a really rewarding. That's just one of the parts of the job that I love.
Yeah. So for me, an example would be working with Sean McGovern in the studio, and he's so prolific at writing songs, but he is self-admittedly limited in how he strums an acoustic guitar. So he'll play the guitar with these chord changes and stuff, and he'll come up with these great melody ideas, and he'll repurpose lyrics from poetry and all that. But then, an easy first reaction for me might be, oh, but these, because of the guitar, these sound the same to me. And so I would have a discussion with him. It was like, hey, do you want to play guitar on this? And then he'd say, no, I don't want to play. You play guitar. And then it's like, oh, well, is it cool if we rethink how these songs go together? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. And if without the discussion beforehand, we would have just, in fact, the first time we hit the studio, I put a guitar in his hands, and in hindsight, we all looked at it and thought, maybe he should have just sang, and we should have just come up with whatever we wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that whole discussion beforehand. And then another example, or to finish that thought, it's the discussion beforehand that allowed me to realize that, oh, it's like an open book. I can reinterpret this on piano or electric guitar, or with a different groove or a different tempo.
Yeah.
And so that was really liberating for us. Another version was going into the studio and doing the opposite with somebody like Will Kimbrough years ago, where early on, where it would probably, I don't remember how I heard the songs. I might have heard acoustic versions first, or him with the band, but I just wanted to like go crazy with the production with him and make them all elaborate and all kinds of fun stuff, which we did. But then after he was done with the record, which turned out great, in discussions with him, I learned, well, really, for him to survive as an artist at that point, he needed to be able to go out and play by himself with an acoustic guitar, which sounds a lot more Americana. And his fans really just wanted records that reminded them of him playing like that. So it's just interesting to like have those discussions and realize, what kind of record do you really want to make? Sometimes the boundary is that. It's just like, what can the artist do with it after?
Sometimes folks have a really clear sense of identity. And like if it's a band, it's like, listen, we've rehearsed these songs. We're all really great players. We have a clear sense of what we're doing. And the role is just like, cool, how do I capture this in a way that's, kind of elevates whatever it is that they've already got going on? And then sometimes it's a complete like, those are the chords you wrote, but are they the best chords? Like,
right.
Can, maybe it'd be cool to switch this up and here in this moment. And then there's these really satisfying moments sometimes where folks are like, oh, I didn't realize things were that fluid. You can just like sing that same melody over this chord and it works. It just feels different. And watching the light bulb moment of like, can we do this to all the songs? It's like, please, let's do it.
Really? On the third round, we could play an A minor instead of a C, and it still works?
Yeah, it's so fun to watch that process happen. And I take it for granted because I get to do this all day, every day. And I have had really great teachers, and I've been able to participate in this in a specific way, and be able to kind of pass that along is really satisfying.
Where are some of the places you feel like you were able to learn some of these things? So especially as somebody who felt like they came into it late, which sometimes I feel that way too, because I didn't pick up a guitar till senior year of high school. But of course I had been exposed to music and took music lessons when I was younger. But like for you, if you feel like you're coming into it late, you must have had some great connections with people to learn things like just chord substitutions, simple ideas like that.
Absolutely. There's something about being like, it's a dangerous place to kind of be the smartest person, or not the smartest, but the most qualified person in the room about, whatever it is you're trying to do. I was lucky enough I grew up in Tucson, which is there's a million people here, but it's kind of a small town. Mm-hmm. So when I went to Seattle and I felt like, I'm pretty good at what I do. And I found out I was Tucson good, and I got my ass handed to me immediately. And it was humiliating and it was embarrassing. And I realized I wasn't nearly as far along as I thought. And I had a few folks that stepped in and were like, okay, I see that the chip to learn all this stuff is there. You just don't have the kind of the background of it, which was accurate. And they were gracious and patient. And it took a little bit of time to kind of get over that hump, but I was pretty motivated and just really obsessed over it and never stopped obsessing over it. And that helped.
That's cool. You know, I mean, I have a sort of a similar take on it here. I mean, I didn't come to Nashville thinking I knew tons. I came with some experience and a lot of love for playing music, and I started at school. Maybe my version is coming out of school as a, intern, early assistant, and finding a studio like Alex the Great with Brad Jones and Robin Eaton, where I heard what they were doing and I was like, oh, this is so cool. But then I still had this internal compass that said, oh, I think I know what a great record sounds is. So let me see if I can, help these guys, make a record sound really great. And then I get in on some sessions and I realized I didn't know shit yet and had so much to learn. So yeah. I think that's a great experience, moving to a place where you can get your ass handed to you. But I would say the flip side is also sometimes I would hear, not even sometimes, I hear people say this a lot in Nashville. They're like, it's like, are you a guitar player? Oh yeah, I play some guitar, but I'd never call myself that in Nashville. And I'm like, come on, people, don't just give up your, because there's great people who are great at something where you are, it doesn't mean you should just let go of it or be afraid to call yourself one too, Yeah. Maybe that's my internal compass because I just want to play more guitar myself. But
sure.
Did you find a little bit of that too? Did you find it could be easy to just kind of like curl up into a corner and not pursue the thing that you wanted to do just because there were other people that were good at it?
Absolutely. And I think where I found my identity around that, because I knew I didn't have the discipline to like play scales to a metronome with guitar to get better at that. Like that wasn't interesting to me. And what I realized was that what I could do and what was interesting to me was developing my taste. So even if I'm producing a record, maybe I'm playing on it, maybe I'm not. But if I'm not, and there's some crazy bonkers musician that is just leaps and bounds anything I can do, I still feel like I have a good sense of knowing if what they're doing is serving the song or not.
Right.
Even if I couldn't play it in a million years, it might be impressive to listen to. That doesn't mean it serves the song. And I realized that was where like, oh, this is my thing. Like I can continue to hone my taste and continue to navigate those relationships between artist and musician or the band dynamics. And that's kind of where I landed.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've felt that way before too. I mean, we can train our ear to identify what's right and wrong in the way a song gets built, even if on the other end of the microphone is just an incredible player who's like miles above our ability.
Mm-hmm.
Just us learning how to have a good, sharp ear as a producer or engineer to give feedback and just say, hey, I think this is working here and that's not working is a great way to have that combination.
It was so intimidating at first because you're just sort of in awe watching this incredible musicianship happen. And then to kind of remove yourself from that, being like, okay, regardless of how impressive it is technically, it's still stepping all over the vocal or whatever it is. And to be able to confidently say like, listen, you're clearly a badass. I need you just to play whole note chords on the chorus and just cool it a second.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, so thanks for the intro into like getting started. Tell us about your studio now. Tell us about Saint Cecilia recording and, or how do you, what's the title is Saint Cecilia Studios?
Saint Cecilia Studios. When I there's been various iterations of it. This is the third. And the first version had a B room. And so the plural made sense. And
always in a commercial space or in a home studio or various combos?
No, always commercial. The first version, so I was in Atlanta and moved back to Tucson, I guess about 10 years ago. And it was in a very large space. It was 3,000 square feet on the top and bottom floors separately. So it was like 6,000 square feet total. It was crazy. And it was in an area that was developing, so everything was cheap at the time. But as it eventually got gentrified, it just became prohibitive to stay there.
Right.
So at the time, I had a big console, like a 48-channel Neotech Elite. That was Merle Haggard's old board. And
that's the first board I started out on in school.
Oh, yeah? It's a great console. It's a really terrific console.
Yeah, and I can't remember whether Steve Albini's is the Elite or if it's a different version of the Neotech.
I think he has an Elite. I think there might be an Elan in one of the other rooms as well.
Maybe you're right, yeah.
But it was a terrific console, and it was functional, easy to use. It just was 12 feet long. My mixed recall notes were happening at various points from a tour bus or from a different place in the country, and so it just didn't make sense I just wasn't taking advantage of having a board like that. So sold the board, downsized, moved to Portland, moved into a small space, did a lot of tracking out of, you mentioned earlier, Jackpot, Larry's place.
Oh, cool.
And other studios to do kind of drum stuff. And I had a smaller room. And then about 4 years ago, right before the pandemic, my wife and I moved back to Tucson with the motivation that each time the studio had to move, it was because developers had bought the building, and we would have to rebuild. And even if we got bought out of the build cost, it still was time. And so I was pretty despondent. Just like, I'm not going to continue to build if we can't find a building to buy.
Yeah.
So we found this terrific spot in Tucson, and built it out here. And it's somewhere in between. It's like 1,200 square feet. It's got a control room and a tracking room and a fairly good size ISO room that's got a piano and other stuff in there. Little lounge. I don't have a console anymore. I just have outboard preamps that I've collected over the years.
Yeah, it's a cool layout. And the website, Rockstars, just a reminder also, we have links to everything in the show notes. So please scroll down after you're listening, or when you want to refer to this, you can go right to the studio, you can see photos. You can listen to Steven's great discography, a variety of music and everything. And in looking at the studio photos, you guys also have, I can't remember if you had the layout, but I could kind of picture it by looking at it. It looks like you took over a long rectangle space and then did a really creative division of this use of the space so that you could have a control room that looks into the live room, but you also have the hallway, and you've also got a lounge and a kitchen and all that great space. And I see the Saltillo tile. That's what I've got in my dining room here.
Yeah, you're in Tucson. That's just standard issue.
Yeah.
You just described it exactly as it is. It's got a long hallway. The hallway and kitchen are wired up in the event that we want to throw amps and stuff in there. But yeah, it's kind of a long rectangle. I based a control room, found some good dimensions that had, those little room modes that I could get in this space. And then a good sized tracking room. It's smaller than I've had before, but I really love it. It's very efficient. I can work really quickly. And as I've done this longer, I realize that's an important part to me staying engaged in it, is to not spend too long on stuff, but to be able to kind of be up and running quickly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've had variations of that. I used to practice the blank slate theory, which is like the studio gets torn down to zero in between sessions. And then finally, where I'm at now is, let's just leave everything mic'd up so that I can quickly go to an idea. Mm-hmm. And then the next stage for me will be, what the hell do I do with all these cables if I leave everything set up?
Yeah, similar. Like if I can keep the wire between the idea and the execution as short as I can, that I find that to be really helpful.
Like literally just the length of cable run for sonics, or just short in terms of like it's not in your way underfoot?
Oh yeah, sorry, more like a brain wire. Like if I have an idea, to be like, I have an idea. Okay, let me pull out all these mics and patch it and route it. And it's just, when I start a project, I typically have stations so that there's a guitar idea, we're 45 seconds away from tracking that idea.
Yeah, I agree. And now in hindsight, I'm like, how stupid was it to think that it was okay to start setting up an instrument when the artist wanted to record something? For me, the lesson was learned by trying to do more stuff in my own studio for myself. And then you realize, like, okay, if we've only got an hour or 2 hours to go make some music, I never wanted it. Like, very quickly, I was like, I don't want to spend an hour setting up to do something because now I don't want to do anything. Do you sometimes do that, but then feel like you wish you had a better sound and had taken longer to explore a sonic possibility in that moment? Or do you find that it always just feels like, thank God we just played the piano part as fast as we could think of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. There have been times I try to not paint myself into a corner as often as I can. For example, I'm grabbing a DI of the guitar if we're tracking guitars. I'm grabbing a DI. I 99% of the time don't need it. But in the event, it's like, man, the part's great, but we really could have spent some more time making that more special. I have that option.
Is that for a guitar room overdub from the control room, or would you do that even if they were out by the amp in the other room?
Both, yeah. I always capture a DI. There's just been too many times where the idea was happening in a really excellent way, but maybe we were recording live and we're worried about bleed. Maybe we just wanted to get the idea down. And I do most of the tracking, honestly, from the control room. If I can keep people off of headphones, I try to. I have pass-throughs, speaker level and line and instrument level, so they can have their pedal board in here and the amp in the other room, or their head in here and their cab in the other room.
Have you figured out yet how to have the drummer in the control room, but the drum set out in the other room? Because that would be something.
Mm-hmm. Rolling V drums. It's terrific.
All right, there you go, man. Good answer. Hey, rock stars. Yeah, you. I've got a secret to tell you. Want to know how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording studio rock stars? My secret is using iZotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, Voice Enhancement Assistant, and Nectar to make sure every episode of this podcast sounds great. Right now, you are hearing RX Breath Control, D-Click, D-Clip, DS, Deplosive, Voice Denoise, Ozone Multiband Compression, Neutron EQ, VEA, and Limiting, all from iZotope. Use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off or pick up the new Trash Light along with many of the other free cool plugins over at iZotope.com. All right, cool. So then, well, let's stay on that that topic for just a sec, because it comes up, the idea of capturing the DI of the guitar when you record so that blank. Talk a little bit more about the blank. Talk a little bit about some of the situations where you're like, glad we got the DI, I'm going to do this now, and we just improved on our guitar sound.
Yep, guitar and bass is where it especially happens. I love if it's possible to get basics down as a band, where everybody's kind of playing together. If it's possible to do, if the band's good enough to do it, I think that is always my go-to. So I always capture DIs just in case something happens, some magic happens that is not going to be recreated at a later point. We're not bound to whatever amp sim is going on, or, low volume thing because we're trying to keep bleed down.
Right.
And yeah, but even if I'm doing overdubs in here, I always just grab it. It's one extra track. I hide and make it inactive 99% of the time. But if it's like, oh, that'd be cool to do in stereo, but we didn't really have that set up for stereo, and we can still have that option later.
Right. That's true. Because you can always even if, like you said, you could be recording. So my example might be, very often I've got 2 amps in the dead room, and each one just has a dead ISO room. I call it the phone booth. And each amp just has a 57 on it in mono, but I might wish that guitar was more stereo later. If I've got the DI, I can feed it back out to an amp again in the live room even, and just put a room mic on it and play it back through and re-record that room mic later, because there aren't drums now in that room, and then create more of a carefully constructed stereo sound for that guitar before mix.
Absolutely. And there are some amps, some sounds that really can only happen at ungodly volumes. And to have that option where you can turn the amp, set the amp up, walk back into the other room where you're not going to get obliterated, and be able to kind of get that sound from a safer space.
Right. I think of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they refer to the loudest band in the universe, I think it is, or maybe it's the galaxy. And the band is so loud that the only way to enjoy it is 20 miles away inside a concrete bunker. And the band themselves play all their instruments from remote controls in a spaceship that's orbiting the planet.
That is incredible. Douglas Adams was brilliant.
Yeah. So there you go, rock stars. So if you thought you were loud, don't panic. All right. So let's talk more about your studio. So you've maybe talk about some of the choices you made in building your new studio. You talked about, we're going to buy a building, not rent it. So that's, again, limits to art. So that became a new limit for you. Like, okay, here's the shape and size. Yep. Can I fit a studio in there? What are some other decisions you're clear on making where you're like, okay, cool, this really works for my workflow. So therefore, this is going to go here, or it's going to be hooked up this way or that way?
Yeah, I am really grateful that this wasn't my first build, because I had this sort of collection of good and bad experiences in my own room and working out of other rooms, where I was like, oh, I'm going to hijack this idea for myself at some point. And yeah, it was limited to 1,200 square feet. I knew that I wasn't going to worry about a console. I have 24 IO. I wasn't going to worry about, splitting that out over a giant board.
Did you choose 24 versus something else? Like, why not 32 IO, for example?
Okay, so with the artistic limitation, because I have these Switchcraft 1/4-inch TT, they're full-size patch bays, and they are 24 wide. Right. And I was like, cool. I almost never record more than that at a time, and if I do, I can go to a different room and do that. If for some crazy reason I really need 32 live IO, then I'll figure that out then. But I wasn't going to base the economics of the studio around a scenario that was at the time fictitious.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just kind of I already had these patch bays. I didn't want to rebuy them. I'd already soldered them, and I didn't want to resolder them.
Yeah, I know. Once you've done some patch bays, you're like, let's see can we reuse those ones? I've been there many times.
No question. So yeah, I 24 IO, and then I have 24 outboard preamps that serve various roles. There's some that are like, these are always on my kick drum, or these are always on my snares. I love these. If it's a bright mic, this is a great tube pre that makes it a little tamer and smooths out some of the top end. Just kind of things I've figured out over the years that I enjoy that sound good to me. I have a fair amount of outboard that I commit. Where I track with it. That's the only time I use it. I don't mix with it, but I definitely commit to a sound going into Pro Tools.
Yeah.
And some of that's budget. Like, people don't have, the money to spend to endlessly delay decisions. And I found that people play differently when it sounds like what it's eventually going to sound like. If the drummer knows it's going to be this big blown out drum kit, he's going to play it differently than if it just sounds like a nice, clean, polite drum kit.
Yeah. I may have just played a little bit of music accidentally in the background. We'll see if that showed up in my recording.
Oh,
I was just flipping. Well, I was flipping over in my browser to look at the photos of your control room setup too. And I noticed you made some decisions, like your desk is literally a desk. It's literally like a nice vintage wooden desk, because now we're in a world of computers, which is a screen and a keyboard and a mouse, you know?
Yep. Yeah.
And then you also made decisions like putting racks of gear on one side of the room and keyboards and synths on the other. Were any of those sort of challenges to figure out, or is it all? I'm guessing that part of your decisions, like mine, they're so dumb sometimes, our decisions. I mean, they're smart, but they sound dumb because it's like, well, really, it's like, you know, the cable's only this long, so these things just have to go next to each other, you know?
Yep, that's 100% correct. There's sometimes very unsexy reasons why a thing is where it is, or that's the control room. Yeah, I got outboard on one side, I have keyboards on the other. That is mostly so that I can quickly roll over to a piano to work on something with somebody, and everything's just kind of ready to go at all points. And then the preamps and outboards on my left, so I can kind of stay in a reasonable spot. The whole studio in general is, like the vibe of it is like not very studio-y. I never really cared for some of the bigger rooms I worked at where it kind of felt like you had to put on a surgical glove to move a fader.
Right.
And it's like, well, how do we just like make it feel like a cool Airbnb that just happens to have a bunch of recording gear in it? And that's kind of what we ended up doing. I did this record in Detroit, outside of Detroit, on this horse farm, and it was an old barn that had been gutted. And the producer's name was Tim Palatine, or Tim Padalin, and he had done like the first few Sponge records back in the 90s, and had used that money wisely and built out a really terrific studio. And it was just an old barn. You'd never know it. And immediately I was like, oh, I never want to go back to a studio again. This feels really good.
Yeah, well, there's something to be said for spaces that feel like the spaces that you wanted to make music in the first place, you know?
Yep.
Fun. I mean, my studio has a feel to it, even after we remodeled it and it looks a bit more like a spaceship. But I mean, part of that feel is because I've filled it with instruments that I like, and I've got memories of experiences of making music in there. But like, if I think about the places where I'm inspired to write a song with my friends, and I think about like how much I like doing road trips and taking a guitar with me, it's because I'm not in a studio. It's because I'm like out in the real world.
Yep.
And so it's nice when the studio also has some of that quality, you know. But it was funny is then you got the flip side. Then you got like the Rick Rubin's, just Rick Rubin telling us that, you know, Shangri-La studio is like everything's white because you don't want to be influenced. You want to let the music be the influence.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. You know?
That's a really Rick Rubin quote. I love it. And also, disagree is not the right word, but it's like that doesn't connect with me. And to me, it's a testament to like how subjective everything really is.
Yeah.
My favorite people and people that have influenced me over the years nearly always start out their thoughts with, well, in my experience, or well, that's just my opinion, but this is kind of how I do things. And it doesn't mean you have to shy away from having an opinion. It just means, you know, this is my experience of this. And somebody might walk into my room being like, man, it doesn't look like Starship Enterprise, not interested. And that's okay. That's totally okay.
You know, I think Rick would agree because he talks about the importance of making records and art for yourself, not for the audience. And an ultimate expression of making a record for the audience would be like some corporate blockbuster film that's sort of written by committee and produced by committee, and nobody's sort of personally invested in it. And that it just feels empty. I guess there's no reason why studios don't follow the same rules. It's like if you try and make a studio, you do want to make it for your clients because you want them to be comfortable. But if you don't make it for yourself too, then it probably won't be expressive in a genuine way to the people that come over to record.
I think that's true. And I used to try to chase down everything as if I was the most qualified person to do it. And I've just realized sometimes I'm not. Like, not because I couldn't, but just because there's probably a better experience for myself and for them. And sometimes I'll pass off a project to somebody else and I'll tell them like, this just feels like a future resentment for myself. Like, I feel like I'm not going to be the right guy for this. And if I try to be, I'm going to end up regretting it. The client's going to know that. And I shouldn't do it.
I know. I feel like sometimes if my internal voice says, well, I could do that, then that's an indicator that I shouldn't do it.
Totally. Yeah.
Like, if my internal voice says, oh, I got this, this is my favorite thing to do in the world, then I should do it.
Yep. Yeah. Sometimes things fall into a third category for me where I want to say yes because I want to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
Like I've done a fair amount of like music for film stuff, and I'm not a composer. I'm a high school dropout. I don't have a background in composition, but I was like, oh, this person accidentally used the music that I had written, and now they want me to do more of it. I'm going to figure it out. I'll say yes and figure it out and hopefully not make an ass out of myself. And sometimes that works out. Sometimes
make a badass out of yourself.
What's that?
Make a badass out of yourself.
Make a badass out of yourself. That's right.
So tell us a little bit more about your new studio design. What else comes to mind? Like, what about for mixing? Did you intentionally set up anything where you're like, now I just go into mix mode and it's ready and waiting for me?
Yes. When the projects have a budget for it, I try to have an assistant do that. It's two different parts of my brain. And if I can keep one less the sort of administrative, technical side less engaged, I enjoy the project more. I don't get burnt out on the songs. I try to listen to a mix as few times as possible before I get into it, just so I don't start making decisions because I'm bored or I've heard the song too much. So I have everything set up with templates, and I don't have a console, but I have this little return that I use for line returns, because I realized that was the one part about a console that I missed, was being able to break out Pro Tools returns and have like if I'm tracking, I'll have, drums are here on 1 and 2, bass is on 3, and I don't have to mouse it to hear it. I can just quickly throw up a fader, see if the drummer's playing to a click and if it's going okay, things like that.
So is that an analog summing mixer?
It is. It's a spec via fader. It's just I don't use it to sum at all.
Okay.
Everything's done in the box, but I do use it to just break out. Like I might have a reference mix of a similar genre or something over on 1 and 2, and then my mix is always on 3 and 4. The click is always on 7. And then I have just kind of some open faders where I can listen to rough mixes and various things quickly.
Okay, cool. I see it. So it looks kind of like an 8 fader box or something like that.
Yep.
That's sort of like almost like a miniature console, but really it's just faders. So that just gives you, it's almost like having that much of a console for your master section instead of just a volume knob and, switch between inputs A, B, C, D. You've got a little mixer that lets you at least, bring the faders up to different levels and mute them and solo them.
Yep.
So that it's very, very quick for, and when you say click on one fader, that's so that it makes it easier in the tracking stage, but other faders might make it really easy in the mixing stage where you can listen to the mix you're working on, balance with the fader, the other fader, the reference mix, quickly go back and forth.
Yeah.
Have the rough in there and other stuff like that.
Yeah, it's super utilitarian. I'd wanted somebody to build it for a long, long time. And Spec ended up being the first one that did it. And I love it. It's just utilitarian, but I love it. Just from a workflow perspective, I love it. And it satisfied the part of a console that I missed having.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM artists, TV and film composers all have in common with you and me? We all need amazing sounds that instantly elevate our music to the desired style. That's why Native Instruments is your ultimate toolkit, offering a massive library of sounds for your studio. Whether you're into hip-hop, indie pop, classic rock, meditation music, dance beats, or orchestral arrangements, the Native Instruments Complete Bundle has it all. From drums, loops, and beats to synths, realistic strings, vintage bass, guitars, and keys, it's a comprehensive collection. I love recording real bands in my studio, but then enhancing the tracks with drum samples, synths, and futuristic keys from Battery, Contact, Massive X, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid keys, for example. It's a surefire way to make your productions sound modern and unique. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off or get Complete Start for free today, featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples at nativeinstruments.com. Adam Audio is celebrating 25 years of researching, developing, and manufacturing industry-leading monitoring solutions in Berlin. To mark this milestone, our friends at Adam Audio are unveiling a special limited edition series of monitors that will look stunning in your studio and sound as awesome as your music. Introducing the Arctic White A4V and A7V series. Available for a limited time to pro and home studio owners like yourself, the clean, glossy white finish exudes a luxurious feel and will stand out in any studio or home audio system. Featuring the XART accelerated ribbon tweeter design and customizable speaker voicings, the Arctic White A4V and A7V retain the full specifications of the original design. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Adam Audio's commitment to delivering professional-grade, high-fidelity sound to studios worldwide has made these monitors a perfect fit for Grammy-winning producers in both pro and home studios for a quarter of a century. Now you can bring that beautiful high-fidelity sound to your own productions and make your studio look as cool as your music sounds. Don't miss out on the limited edition Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a short time with the standard extended 5-year warranty at adamaudio.com. Howdy, Rockstars. We're back now for the jam session, aka the second half of the show. My guest today is Steven Tracy, joining us from Tucson, Arizona. Are you ready to jam, partner?
I am ready.
That was a little, Southwestern, living on the range reference there. I don't know if it carried.
You'd fit right in here. We say that all the time.
Okay. Partner. Actually, I've got family there. And then, of course, Björgvin Benediktsson is right there from Audio Issues, a good friend of mine and one of the two folks that we thanked for introducing us in the first place.
Yeah.
I think you guys have worked together in the past, yeah?
We have. Yeah. He actually just lives a few blocks from here.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, right on. So another thing that you mentioned about your studio setup, to get a little bit techie, you talked about, your particular choices in terms of just hard disk storage, or SSD storage. And then also I wanted to ask you about your monitoring and what helps you in terms of monitors for mixing.
Yeah, I have the monitors. I have 2 sets of monitors. I have some ATC's SCM25s, and I have Adam's A7Xs, which I've had they were my first proper pair of monitors. They were probably 12 years ago. And then I upgraded to the A77Xs, which they were the 3-way version. And I don't know if I could ever get rid of them. I've just been on them for so long and I know them so well. They have 2 roles. They're in the control room for monitoring, and I also use them for reamping. I will put them in the other room, run programmed drums through it, and then mic the room and smash it with a limiter, kind of give it some depth.
Really? So you'll feed the drums back out into your A7s, X's, and then re-record the rim mics from that?
Yep. Yeah. It's something I started doing recently, and I love it. I don't do it with regular drums because I'll record room mics like during the session, but things like sometimes I'll be writing something that's supposed to sound like a real drummer, but I don't have the budget for a real drummer. So I'll just pump that out into the tracking room and through the atoms and then smash them through a Zener limiter. And it's really effective. It works great.
How far do you have to turn up the speakers? I mean, I think some of us might wonder about that, but then be afraid we're going to blow up a speaker. What have you learned about that?
Yeah, I don't really turn them up that loud. Maybe 95 or 100 dB.
Okay.
Louder than I would ever monitor with, but certainly within like what they're capable of recreating it without crazy distortion. And I'll just kind of move the mics until it feels like it's the distance it's supposed to be from that.
Well, one of the cool things about doing that trick is if you've already recorded a vocal in your studio space, maybe acoustic guitars or any other instrument, but the drums feel alien, maybe the drums, because they're digital, feel different, and a lot of drum packages might come with room mics built into it, but you might pull it up and you'd be like, what the hell kind of room is that?
Yeah.
What was that?
I wonder that all the time.
Yeah. And then I'm like, I'd never hear a studio sound like that. I'm used to the home studio sound. So your method can create a sense of space around the drums that might actually match the vocals and other instruments in the mix and make it sound more cohesive.
Yeah. With programmed drum, I mean, it can be done as an effect just because it sounds cool, or it can be done to try to simulate something that's a little realer. But it's tough with programmed drums to, like, you can do things like, program all the drums out, but just record the hi-hat separately and have a human play it.
Right.
Just any little measure of imperfection that you can add in to kind of give it some humanity. And this is just kind of one of those things that seem to help with that is, sound bouncing off walls in a really like primitive band space kind of way is how I grew up hearing music. So it feels weird to not hear a room that I'm familiar with.
Right. So in other words, I mean, this goes back to our Cecelia the MCI console reference. Saturday Night Fever was done. Staying Alive was done. Which one was it? I think it was Saturday Night Fever was first, right? No, Staying Alive was first. I can't keep track. Anyway, Staying Alive has got the, it was a loop for kick and snare, and then the percussion and I think maybe hi-hat stuff was overdubbed.
Yeah.
And that was a classic way to build up a loop sound. So you had that steadiness of a loop, but it felt, had the excitement of live on top. And so if you did something like that and you record real hi-hats and maybe even real cymbals in your space, you're going to have the sound of the rim on there. And by reamping the kick and snare, now it sort of like adds that rim sound to those as well.
Yep, absolutely. And I didn't know that about the Bee Gees song, but that makes sense. And it's a really kind of handy way to get around some of the sterility of, sample packs and fake rooms and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know why I was being so dumb about it. Saturday Night Fever is the movie. The song was Staying Alive. But the drummer was here, and I got to meet him, and he talked about doing the sessions, and he said he was away from the studio when they started the writing of the song, and then he came back, and they were like, well, we just, we did this placeholder of the loop of the kick and the snare, and he just said, that sounds great. You should just use that for the record, and so that's how it came about.
That's cool.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then what about, you mentioned something about hard drive setup and, we've all got to have a place for all our audio to actually fill up space, right?
We do. Yeah. I got these OWC Thunder Bay 4 RAID arrays, or they're set up as RAID arrays. Some projects I can't store. There's like, contractual clauses that I can't store on cloud for various reasons. And
Right.
so I feel like I have to have a bulletproof way here.
And that's especially true when you start interacting with television and film, right?
Yes. And yeah, there's NDAs and various things that go into it. And then the continuation of that is cloud storage clauses and that kind of thing. So yeah, it hasn't happened often. Once or twice in my career, I had to have an awful conversation because a drive went toes up. And I just never want to have that conversation again. So everything's kind of writing to 2 drives, and then it gets dumped over to this archive drive, and it looks like overkill. And every intern that comes in here, when I explain, like, this is how it has to happen, and if you can go your whole career without ever having to tell somebody we just lost a week and a half's worth of work, then I'll have done my job.
Yeah, it's great advice. Let's talk about it in 2 different directions. So I will say for the rock stars, in the direction that Steven said you shouldn't go, if you're working with clients that are on a level where they say this cannot be on the cloud, and the reason they would say this cannot be on the cloud is because it's not secure enough. In other words, if music for a film or a TV show or for a big name artist that, everything hinges on the release and the secrecy of the new record, if that all is in such a state where you can't take any risks of it being leaked early, then they're going to say, you have to store all this locally and internally. If you have a home studio and that's not a concern and your only concern is just back up, so that if your hard drive dies, you've still got a copy of it, then, a couple of things that I practice that you might find helpful is, one is just been built into Mac for a long time. It's just Time Machine. I just got get a big fat 8 terabyte or bigger spinning hard drive that doesn't cost too much. Throw that in a slot and let Time Machine just do like a backup of everything that's happening. So that's helpful. And then the other is Backblaze is a really cool cloud version that just always backs up whatever's on your computer, as long as it's, I think it defaults to like whatever's been on there in the last 30 days. So that's a really easy and expensive way to make sure you're always backed up. Now back to Steven's version, which is, as you described, Steven, a way to say, hey, let's just say we're not allowed to use the cloud. We've got these other options. So do you want to break it down a little more? I think, did you say it was a RAID array or something like that? Because you talked about recording to 2 drives at once.
Yeah, I have 2 of these Thunder Bay 4 things, and there's 4 hard drives in each one. But it's really only 2 hard drives because they're both, the same information is getting written to 2 drives simultaneously. So it's only shows up as 1 hard drive on my desktop. And they're set up just in case one drive tanks, I'm not totally screwed. And I have 1 for samples, 1 for current project files, 1 for video projects, and 1 that's just an archive drive that I dump everything onto that archive drive, so it's in an extra place.
So let me say that back to you. So if you have 2 Thunder Bay 4s, then these are pairs of drives, each thing. Mm-hmm. Is that the way to think of it?
Yep. There's 4 pairs of drives.
So 2 drives shows up on your computer as if it was 1 drive, but really it's writing to 2.
Correct.
So if one gives out or has dropouts or dies, it's still there on the other one, and it still looks like 1 working drive on as far as your computer is concerned.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. And then what about archiving? Have you learned any good tips for what that is? Do you use like a ChronoSync scheduler and just have it schedule backups to the archive at the end of every day, or is it simpler than that?
Nope. I just do it manually. There's the archive drive gets filled until it's full. And then I just take them out. I have an Excel spreadsheet that has dates and what's on that drive. So if in a year from now, a client comes back and said, hey, we got a licensing deal with this song, we need an instrumental version or we need a vocal up version, I can know, okay, that's on this drive. I have a little SATA dock that I can SATA, or however you pronounce it, pop it in, and I know right where it is. That is a new thing. I have not trained anybody here yet on that yet because I'm still developing because I want to get some search functions going so I can just look up a client name. Is there better ways to do that?
Well, so I was going to ask you some of these questions. There used to be, back in the day, there used to be a cool app called CD Finder. So back when we used to archive everything to DVDs, you just load when you pop the DVD in, CD Finder would automatically put it into its own database. So you could search on your computer and it would tell you which DVD things were on. I haven't found something like that yet for hard drives that are on the archive shelf, and I'm a little surprised by it. But I like your idea of having a spreadsheet. And, for me, a version of that would be I would just buy 2 drives, and then when I pull a session off of my work drive on the computer, I just drag it over to, what would I do? I would drag it. I like the move function a lot because I like dragging a file to something else and then letting the computer worry about once it's been successfully copied, it deletes itself because I hate having to delete anything.
Yeah.
But
there is that moment of holding your breath every time.
Yeah. And I just don't want to have to work my brain so hard to confirm. I'm like, you count on the computer to do its computering right, all the time. But I mean, for example, I might drag everything over to my master archive drive, and then I'll have a matching name archive drive called backup. And it might be called the Toy Box Studio 2024 master, the Toy Box 2024 backup, for example. And then once it's backed up on, once it's fully copied onto both drives, I'll delete it from my work drive when I'm trying to make space on the computer. One of the ways that I find it helpful to confirm that it's successfully copied everything is if I then go to drag it one more time onto the archive drive, once it's already been copied, it will tell me, would you like me to replace the one that you've got? And that's an indicator to me that it already finished copying everything there. Because otherwise it'll say, if they weren't complete, it'll say, would you like to merge these two?
Yeah.
If there's something new.
I definitely do that as well. But
it's cool, your idea of the archive RAID thing that's automatically copying onto both drives at the same time, because maybe when they fill up, you just pull it off. But go ahead and comment on that. And I've got another question related to how do we work on this stuff again, 2 months from now.
Yeah, my wife, fortunately, is just an Excel mastermind, at least to me. So she's been helping put together these things that are kind of searchable. And when something goes onto the archive drive, I just enter it into this document. I can search that document by client name or date, and it'll tell me what drive it's on. And then I just have those stored offsite. And I can
How do you make a spreadsheet of what's on a drive?
Client name, date, and
you just
maybe the project
manually
name.
Type each thing into the spreadsheet. It's not like you can copy the window, Finder window of a drive and then just hit paste in a spreadsheet or anything like that.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. That's something to try.
Maybe it is. I don't know. I don't know exactly how that works. You might want to know, what was in each folder and all that. I bet there's got to be a tool out there. Rockstars, if you know of any tool that automatically copies, hard drive or storage file trees that you can paste into a spreadsheet, drop a comment in wherever you're listening to this, if there's any kind of comment, or just hit me with an email and I'll get it that way. Well, that's very cool. So then if you've got the spreadsheet, let's say it's even a Google Doc for us that are using Google, you should be able to search in there and then just find out, where was it? Oh yeah, it's on, the 2022 drive or whatever, and you can go look for it there. But what happens to me sometimes is then I go find it on the old drive and a couple of questions pop up. One is is this really the last version that I worked on this drive? Or did I archive it again on the 2023 drive? So that's one question that pops up.
Yeah.
And then another question that happens is I'll drag it back over to my work drive and work on it. Sometimes I'll just work off the archive drive for a minute if I think it'll work.
Sure.
But if I'm really going to work on it, I'll bring it over to the studio drive again. And then when it's done, then the question is, where do I put it back? Do I put it now on the 2024 archive drives? Because part of me says, yeah, put it on move it back off the computer onto the most recent archive drives, because at this point, now it's yet one more copy of it on the shelf that can last forever.
Yeah.
But it does beg the question of keeping track of like, where's the last version of this thing? And, are we working on the most recent thing, or did we somehow get confused?
In my world, it would look something like file title would be last name, comma, first name, underscore, licensing, instrumental version update, or something that lets me know this is different than the album that we did 2 years ago. This is a new thing. And I would do what you just said. I'd drag it onto the archive, drag it onto the working drive and re-archive it as a new thing.
Dates really help. But sometimes when you go back in time, it's hard to remember, like, what was the last date we did something.
Well, there's so many things. And who knows, like, what plugins that I had then, plugin subscriptions I may have had that I don't have now. Is there a virtual instrument that I didn't print that I lazily left in MIDI? Just those kinds of things it's weird how much like unsexy decision-making has to happen so that the good stuff can happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, it does conclude that a good strategy is one where you have just a running set of notes for yourself. So if you're organized Rockstars enough to have a folder, say it's a Google Drive folder, and it's just that artist's name and that project, and you just always go there and you just write down a note, on this date, I did this thing, then that can help us go back in time and, locate those things on archive drives or whatever,
Yep.
All right, cool. Well, that's probably enough of that nerdiness for now, but that's a good tip. And thank you for that. Oh, I guess one last thing I would say is, have you ever explored, like in my studio setup, I have my studio's in a separate building from the house. So I would have that, that question mark of like, maybe I should have an internal network over the Ethernet cable where I can reach drives up in the house so that, if there's a fire in one space or the other, for example, God forbid, the drives are still safe in a different location. I know that's possible, especially with those automatic backup drives or services like ChronoSync, for example. You can actually back up through the internet to other drives somewhere else. But in your case, probably not if it is not allowed to go to the internet at all.
If I lived in LA and my house was an hour from the studio, I would absolutely have some version of that. I live 4 blocks from here, and I have a box with all my archive drives at the house, so that if the studio burned to the ground, I've got a box.
Which it never will.
Never will. No, of course. But yeah, it's just 4 blocks down the road if I needed to access something.
Yeah. I am really impressed with iZotope Ozone. I've been mastering many of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy to get a fantastic sound. The built-in mastering assistant helps by analyzing the mix and suggesting all the settings needed for a professionally mastered result based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want, using simple yet sophisticated modules like clarity, impact, low-end focus, stabilizer, imager, exciter, and spectral shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting. You just adjust the settings to your taste and it sounds incredible. And the magic of master rebalance means you can manipulate the level of the vocal, bass, and drums even at the mastering stage. Amazing. My bandmates are pretty demanding, but now when I send off the masters for approval, they absolutely love the way our records sound thanks to iZotope. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off Ozone or other tools like RX and Voice Enhancement Assistant, or grab any of the cool free plugins like the new Trash Lite at iZotope.com. Well, cool. Well, that's kind of what I do too, and things come and go. And sometimes I'm like, well, let me leave the master drive in the studio and the backup archive in the house, and I guess in the end, Rockstar's, the thing that counts is as long as you know where to find whatever it is you're doing, you're probably pretty good. And if you've released the record and it's already on streaming, you might be good. I mean, some records you need to come back to later. Some of them, one time's good enough.
This is true.
All right, so let's see what we want to talk about now. You're doing mixing as well. You've got your studio. You've probably gotten to know the sound of your tracking space intimately at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Do you sometimes mix things that are recorded elsewhere? And maybe you can talk about the experience of hearing the sound of different spaces while you're working, coming out of your control room monitors.
Yeah, it's probably half of the work I do is mixing projects that were tracked somewhere else. And I sort of think of the room as a neutral spot where I know what the room sounds like. I try to take that out of the equation so I can just kind of listen to what the tracks I've been given are. Like, are there problems to fix? And if there are, I know it's coming from the tracks, not from the room.
Right. So if there's room mics in there, you just simply keep them muted for a while you listen to the music itself, the close mics.
Yeah, I just did this. Yeah, I just did this mix of a live record. And the intent was that it sounded like it was being played outdoors. I mean, it was played outdoors, but that it was reflecting off the back wall. And that was this kind of weird, like, okay, we're sort of simulating it sounding more live than it was because all we had was close mics. And that was kind of a weird, like, okay, this room is neutral. So if we're going to create this noisy live thing, that's got to come from elsewhere.
Was that the, I don't know if I wrote it down, but there's one where you hear almost like the drums and some stuff over to the right a little, and then a vocal comes in and you hear a lot of close ambient space around the vocal to the left a little bit. I don't know if that was it.
Oh, I may have done something similar with that, but no, this one hasn't come out yet.
Okay, cool. Well, so in that case, just muting whatever the echo or the slapback or the room helps you focus on just the instrumentation and the performance and timing.
I always get it. Like I usually start out in mono and I'll just kind of listen through. It's just easier for me to hear phase issues in mono, and I can just kind of quickly see if there's anything that needs to get addressed with there, and I'll just kind of slowly start bringing stuff up. It really kind of doesn't matter the genre. It starts the same pretty much every time, and I kind of get all the busy work out of the way, take a break so I can kind of get back to the fun stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is just chipping away at the busy work. For me, doing a podcast, it's scheduling, it's collecting all this stuff from a guest like yourself, having the Spotify playlist ready to listen to the music, having, the intro, and having the document for me to put my questions in so that when I sit down, I can just listen to the music and quickly have fun coming up with ideas and questions about things.
Absolutely.
And, in music, same thing. It's like setting up the tracking for the session. Yeah, it's like what you're talking about. Like, you want to have, on one day, set up the sounds. On the next day, come in and the piano's ready to go and just start recording a piano part.
Yep. Like on band tracking days, I'm also always start out, get everybody set up. We do a take or two of the first song and then walk away for lunch. And we don't listen to it until we get back from lunch. And there's something about that, like, okay, we're moving into a different part of our brain. That's headphone levels should all be ready to go, et cetera. It's time to make something cool and to, get down to the arts, making the art side of things.
Yeah. It's like how to make the music that you record dessert instead of lunch.
Oh yeah, I've never heard that, but that's a good analogy.
I just made that up. Probably a stupid one. Okay, so let's all talk about that. So one of the things listed at your studio was that you have a hearback headphone system, and you've probably experienced building a mix for a band. You've experienced dialing in your own mix. Talk a little bit about that and what you have decided works well for working with the musicians, or talk about things that also don't work and that we might want to be aware of avoiding when it comes to headphones and monitoring.
Yeah, headphones always felt, when I started, you would build a headphone mix. There was in the room that I learned in had this 80 series and even, it was a job that you were never going to get right. And you had limited amounts of headphone mixes that you could prepare. Everybody wanted to hear something different. It was just a time suck. And that hearback stuff is, I have the one that has 8 channels, and it's like drums, stereo, bass, guitar, whatever.
Is it one of their old school ones, or is it one of the newer ones?
It is. No, it's an old one.
Is it? Yeah, okay.
And I've probably had this for, 12 years, something like that. And it's been pretty bulletproof. I have a spare hub just in case it goes down. I can still get a mix going. Yeah. Just kind of send everybody what they would like. I send a sort of a logical breakdown of the song, break it up into drums, bass, guitars, whatever, and let everybody make their own mix. And it saves so much time. I love not having the role of having to predict what somebody wants to hear in their headphones. It's terrific. It's one of the lovely parts of modern recording.
How does that change when you go into overdub? So if you're tracking, the drummer's dialing in their mix, they're putting in enough bass, enough guitar, enough vocal, everybody else is adding enough drums to their mix, et cetera, et cetera. But when you go to overdub, what happens then? Does the mixer have to change and be able to shift with each overdub when you add a new track and then you stack 8 vocals and that sort of thing?
Yeah, totally. My tracking template has everything routed across my line, that spec line mixer. It shows up in a specific place that matches the headphone outputs. And when I switch into overdub mode, everything that's not being overdubbed just goes onto a stereo channel, and I just do a quick rough mix, and then I go into overdub mode where I'm just listening to the main mix on 1 and 2, whatever I'm overdubbing on 3 and 4, and that's the same with the headphones. It matches that. It's terrific with like stuff like vocalists, like if they're doing harmonies and they get to the second part of the harmony and they're like, man, I don't want to hear as much of what I just sang. I want to hear more of the new harmony so I can zone in. It's like, cool, I'll just put the old one in 3. I'm going to put your new one in 4. You blend it how you want to hear it. And then we just keep going.
Okay, cool. So it's pretty easy to get into a quick flow.
Oh yeah.
Working that way.
That's what I love about it.
Yeah. Because that is, of course, we take it for granted, but the challenge of having the headphones be the same thing as the mix in the control room is that you can't necessarily hear what you want to hear, because what you might want to hear in the control room is not necessarily the same thing you want to hear out at the microphone. But the benefit of doing it that way is you never have to think about it. It's just whatever's coming out of output 1, 2 goes everywhere.
Yep.
And as we go into a multi-channel system, we have all this control, but then there are those times where you're like, I don't want to have to think about control. It's like when I use an app that's like, do you want to save that little idea you did? Can you imagine if your voice memo app like insisted that you had to type in a name for every single voice memo when you recorded it? You'd go bananas,
It's an interesting glimpse too, and I take for granted that like gain staging, for example, is just like baked into everything that I do, and so I don't think much about it. But if you're a musician or if you're an artist that isn't familiar with that, and you're going to make your own headphone mix, that might be a new concept to you. So creating like a pleasing blend of the song when you have basically stems is a skill that you might not have. So kind of helping them walk through that, like, oh, your master volume is down to almost nothing. That's why your drums are cranked and you can't hear anything, and helping them walk through that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I guess you could, one of the things you could do is you could take a Sharpie and go out to your little headphone mixer and put a little dash in the master, say, start here, something like that. But it's so true. I mean, I've had little miniature mixers. I've tried all kinds of things. And one of them years ago was just cheap ass personal mixers where you had like 2 inputs, 3 inputs or whatever it was, 4 inputs. And you just run a couple of cables out to it. And then that was somebody's headphone mixer. And you realize just how fast a musician can just completely fuck up a little mixer and have no idea, just destroy it. Then you put on the headphones and you're like, what in the world? Like, why didn't you say something?
Yeah. I remember when I first started touring, having that problem with monitor mixes. Like, I didn't know how to get a good monitor mix,
because you're in the world of in-ears and dialing your own monitor mix in.
And it was like a whole foreign thing. And so I have to remember that somebody might be like super kick-ass at getting their wedge or their in-ears to sound killer to them on stage, put on a pair of headphones and get in here and have no idea how to make that work.
So I'm going to pivot back to something that I've done at my studio that was related to interns. So I would have interns in the studio and I would teach them stuff about the studio. Here's how to do things. Here's where to find the toilet paper. Here's what we do when we're doing a lunch run. Here's the mics. Here's how to set them up. Here's how to coil a cable, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then the next interns would come in and I'd be like, man, finally I was like, God, I'm just having to teach it. Like I just finished teaching the last intern and now they're gone and I got to start all over again. So I devised a simple system where we just created our own YouTube channel. And then every time I taught an intern something new, I'd have them video me on their phone teaching them the thing. And then they would be responsible for naming it and uploading it to our private YouTube channel and just adding it to the intern training playlist.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a simple way to accumulate how-to videos. And, we can remember we've got simple tools like that for us rock stars. Like if we're working with lots of different people and we get tired of having to explain how to do something like a headphone mixer, there's nothing stopping us from making a simple how-to video. And then just that goes out in the welcome message or email to an artist before they even come to the studio, just explaining like, hey, here's a few things about, where to park and what our lunch options are and how to use the headphones when you get here,
Yeah.
It could be helpful.
I
guess another one I thought of doing was having little QR. Now that everybody knows what a QR code is, it would probably look ridiculous to have QR code stickers all over your studio, but you could have one on the headphone mixer and then they just point their phone at it and it's a video explaining how to use the headphone mixer.
Oh man, you're like a systems guy. That's amazing.
I'm a systems guy, but it gets me in trouble too. Cause then you're like, hold on. It's like when I was little, my mom would be like, Elijah, go sweep the floor. And I would spend 20 minutes trying to figure out how to create an automatic floor sweeper instead of just sweeping the floor. Okay. Another piece of gear that I saw in your rack that looked pretty cool is the Empirical Labs Fatso. Tell us what that is and how you like to use it.
Yeah, I love it. I have that version and I have the version that I think Kush did it. It's like a different color and they just kind of reworked the guts. I use it a ton for overheads and room mics. It has a really nice saturation feature that to me helps shave off some, I don't love super tip-top, sizzly high-end unless it's serving a really specific purpose. And that does a really great job to my ears of kind of shaving some of that stuff off in a kind of natural way the tape would. I've recorded the tape, but I didn't like learn and grow up recording the tape. But after I eventually did it sort of almost as a novelty, like, oh, let's do this project to tape. I was like, oh, that's what it does. That's what all these plugins are emulating, but it happens immediately. And yeah, those do a terrific job at it.
Do you feel like all the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all of your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David. Quote, absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mixing process I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session. Close quote. Look, I'm so confident that the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass will take your mixes to the next level that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the Ultimate Snare Mixing Trick, and I'll save a seat for you at the front row table at the Grammys. So I remember hearing that previously, this idea of harsh sounding overheads and using saturation to smooth them out, and then that did the trick. Jamie Tate was the one who brought it up at one point, and I started exploring that. And it's a cool thing to discover. It's like, it's funny, the idea that distortion can actually make things sound more pleasant.
Yeah. I don't remember the specs of it, but there is, whatever the first pushes to tape are just this kind of natural smoothing, compression, distortion. And there are a lot of plugins that do that use, kind of harmonic enhancement to accomplish various things. I love doing it on the front end. There's some things that sound great. Like I have this upright Kawai piano that sounds really great with 414s, but the 414s are kind of too bright. So I kind of shave off some of that brittleness. And sometimes I won't even use it for the compressor. I'll just kind of use it for just to kind of shave off some of that stuff that doesn't sound good to my ears.
So the Fatso is really Empirical Labs analog version of what tape does. Is that sort of the way they think of it?
Yeah, and it's a compressor too. Like there's a variety. Like there's this kind of like multifunction switch where it sort of emulates various compression styles. And I had my tech build this thing that he didn't build it. It's a mod you can do where you can have a potentiometer that plugs into the back that separates the threshold of the compressor from the tape saturation component. Without it, they're bound together. The more you compress, the harder it saturates.
I see. So if you want to saturate without compression or compress without saturation,
exactly,
you can get a little more control over it.
Yeah, and it's really a really handy thing. I love them.
That's cool. Well, Dave Durr's a super genius, and we love him here at Recording Studio Rockstars, that's for sure. The Arouser plugin is a go-to for me on sessions. Mm-hmm. And I'm a HDX Pro Tools user. So I told Dave, I was like, it wins like every time, because when I'm tracking, it's the first compressor that just is instantly available because it's DSP, because of how it installed. So therefore I always just use it. And then I just keep using it when I switch back to native mode for each track for mixing. Yeah. Rather than switching.
Yep.
Okay, so let me jump to a record you did. Rich Kid Fuckery. How's that for a title? Nick Poole. Great title, especially considering your origin story of, not being allowed to listen to music necessarily. And now you're making records with bold names. It's got a cool bass synth intro to it. I noticed you got a lot of great synths in the studio. And I'm sure I know your website even talks about having access to all kinds of virtual synths, and you've made all sorts of styles of music. So, what thoughts do you want to share about how producing and mixing music that's digital that has virtual synths in it is different from working with acoustic instruments that are out in front of microphones? Like, what separates the two? What do you love about both of them? How do you like bringing them back together? Anything you want to say?
Yeah, that song, actually, I didn't produce that song. I just mixed that one. And that was the very beginning of the pandemic. I started getting a lot of recording at home. Why doesn't it sound like my favorite records? And those tracks were sent over to me to mix. And the song was super killer. They had recorded everything in sort of by hand. So there was a kind of a rhythmic pocket that didn't exist yet, because it was just a little, not quite
a little
locked.
loose or something. Yeah.
Yep. And the sounds were cool. And I think I took Pro Tools audio to MIDI function and kind of like, because they didn't send me MIDI tracks. And it's like, man, that bass could be really cool. It's almost there. Grab the MIDI from it and then just kind of swap it out for something that I was familiar with or that I thought would serve better.
Cool.
And just kind of reassembled the song. But that's kind of how that song came together.
What are some bass go-tos for you? Like, what are some things? Would you use an analog synth? Do you have some virtual ones that are fun that you might, like, let's say you had to go create a sound like that today, what would be a few places you would look?
If I had the time, I would use probably, I have a Moog Matriarch that I adore. I love this thing, and I'm still getting my head around it. But that would be a go-to. If it's quick and I just needed to do it on the fly, or if I was doing it at a studio that wasn't mine, which happens from time to time, I would use like UA's Mini Moog plug is terrific. Arturia has their Mini V3 that's awesome. And I can work. Sometimes the decision making isn't what would be the coolest thing to do, but like, how can we do this efficiently and quickly? In that event, I was mixing, so I needed to be able to do it quickly. So I think I probably would have just used virtual stuff.
Cool. Do you try to have like all the virtual synths and stuff like that? Or do you find that once you've got a little stable of ones that work, you intentionally stick to those?
Mostly, I start to get familiar with the interface and the graphic of how, like, for example, Arturia, and I'll get my head around and be like, okay, I see if I want to turn off the delay on a certain plugin, it's going to be the same way, whether it's the Moog or the Juno or the Jupiter.
Yeah. It's that unsexy side of recording.
It's like, unsexy.
But it really is the thing that stands between us and getting the job done at any moment is like, how do I just turn off the reverb on this thing? Like, I just don't want reverb on this one or whatever it is,
Yeah, the sexy part is getting to the conclusion without having to open up a manual or Google anything. It's like, oh, I just wanted this dry bass synth and I know how to do that in Arturia. I'm making that decision right now. I'm the only one who's even going to know if this is hardware or soft synth. Everything's so good these days. The decision-making is mostly around workflow. Like, I have a bunch of modular stuff that's not practical by any means. It could probably be recreated with all the, modular plugs, but it's not as fun. And that's part of it, is like the path is as important as the destination sometimes.
Right. So in other words, using the analog or the modular and having a knob to adjust in real time is the payoff that you need for the overdub, even if you could recreate that digitally sometimes.
Absolutely. And also knowing that, like, next time I open the session, if I used the modular plugin, it's going to be exactly where I left it. But if I use modular hardware, like, that sound came and went. Like, I can't get it back. And there's something about how that impacts decision making that I'm becoming more and more drawn to.
Yeah. I think about all the same things. And on the other end of the spectrum too. So for example, I got the, I had been guilty as charged, but I've got some of the Behringer analog semi-modular synths too. And the Pro 1 and the Pro 800, and both of them do kind of similar sounds, but the Pro 800 has presets. And I realized, I was like, that's like, for some sounds, because they're so complex, the only option is to have something where you can recall a preset, because otherwise it'll just take too long to create the sound.
Yeah.
And then for other ones, the preset is too limiting. You want something that lets you sculpt a sound right there and then in the moment.
Totally.
And it's just interesting thinking about those combos. So like, do you use any of the native instruments stuff as well?
Yeah. I use Contact and a ton of native instrument stuff, and as well as other sort of contact friendly, the Golden Age Grand from, I forget the company that's making that. They have this collection of contact that friendly keys, drums, drum machines, and they just like nailed it. It's like they knew me and created a bunch of stuff that I wanted to hear. Like, I would be friends with these guys.
That's cool. Yeah. And I mean, like some of the sounds are just so otherworldly in a cool way and so complex. I love learning about how it all works, but then sometimes I'm reminded as I look at them like, well, it'd take me half a day to try and come up with this sound. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty glad that there's a preset that I can start with, and just tweak it and adjust it.
Yeah.
And using the native instruments keyboard too, it's so great to be able to see that stuff right there on the screen and immediately have like modification knobs that are pre-routed to adjust the sound and like turn the reverb down, turn the delay down, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But, again, it's that same thing. It's like, it's valuable if I can pull it up quickly and make music with it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also valuable if I can make music slowly, but only if it's the day where I've allotted, the time to make it slowly.
That's right. And not every day is a creative day. Some days are busy work so that when it's time to be creative, you can do it quickly. And I used to think like I used to just get bummed out on days where I was like, I got to do cable routing and fix this and repatch this. And
then you discovered Recording Studio Rockstars and put it on the speakers.
Actually, that happened on my drive to LA.
Oh, right on.
But yeah, there's something about those days that I was like, oh no, there's value to this. And the value is that tomorrow when I have to be able to have an idea and execute it really quickly, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, and 100%. This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. I'll stay on this topic for just a sec, and we are approaching some of our final questions, but the One of the things that I love, and I'm sure a lot of the rock stars do too, is, exploring new instruments. I went and played guitars for 2 hours yesterday at the music store just because I want to get a new telly. And I'm like, I love every minute of doing that,
Yeah.
and like, I love learning about new synths. And, I know I've got a lot of them, but I'd love to have that new digital one and install it too, because it's just fun, to explore that stuff. But one of the challenges for me was always like, how do you accumulate an understanding and a knowledge of all these sounds so that in a moment that I want to use it on a session, I actually know how to hook it up and go for it,
Yeah.
Because that is a real limiting factor. This is, the H9000, which I have in my rack, was always, when it was the H3000, for example, was always an example of that for me in the studio, where I knew it could do really cool things, but I haven't given myself the time to know how to dial it in. So I couldn't go use it quickly on a session. So now, now I'm doing that with my H9000. But so there was a new synth that I got called Synplant 2 recently, and I'd seen a lot of cool things on YouTube about it. And it's awesome, really awesome synth. But sitting down to play with it, what I did is I was like, what happens if I just pull up the Hijack app and I just, record an MP3 while I'm playing with the synth? Then I can load that in and just listen to it when I'm driving around the car. And I found that was a really fun way to do it. Like, you can give yourself the playtime of messing with the sound and record it onto a long file, and then just enjoy listening to it in the car to where you're like, oh yeah, that sound was great. So That was a long preamble, but you know what I'm saying? It was like, it kind of gives yourself a chance to remember it again later. And I can connect enough of those dots in my head. I might not know what patch I was on, but I can at least remember, oh yeah, that was that synth I was checking out, and it's that kind of sound. So now I'm going to know to go look for it on a session.
It's that playtime is so important. Like, I can't tell you how many times I'll come in early and just sit at the piano and just fuck around for just the fun of it.
Yeah.
And something that comes up is quickly recorded into a voice memo so I don't forget it, turns into the bridge of a song I'm working on with somebody, and we're just kind of stuck and we need a bridge. It's like, oh, well, I was kind of playing around with this thing, and you eventually kind of develop this well that you can dig into. And that can be the same with gear. And I do that all the time, where it's I'll fuck around until I find something cool and be like, okay, this is appropriate and it makes me feel floaty. So if I need something that needs that floaty vibe, then this is my thing. And I'll jot it down as such so I can get back to it if I need to. But yeah, whether it's a chord or a distortion pedal, they all have feelings, at least to me. And knowing how you can get back to that, a tube screamer is going to be different than a blues breaker. And, you just want to know which paint color to paint with.
Right. And I think sometimes we get stuck on the idea that we would need to know exactly how to get back to a sound, when sometimes what we need to know is just we want to go in the direction of a feeling for a particular song or production. And that instrument or that tool kit is how we could get to that feeling,
Totally.
All right, let me jump into a couple more questions here. With your new studio build and, your ability to make it look really well thought out and organized, what tip do you want to share with the rock stars about organization? I mean, we already talked about archiving and backup, but what other thing comes to mind for you as an organizational resource or a tip, whether it's physical or whether it's something digital? How do you keep your shit together with your new studio?
Well, a few months ago, I've been asking a friend of mine a friend of mine asked me if I had been diagnosed ADD, and I have not been. But it's something I've been wondering for a long time, because it doesn't matter for various reasons. And I said, well, no, look how organized I am. Everything's color coded, and this is how files get named. And they're like, haven't you heard the joke? Hey, did you ever forget to put on your shoes in the morning? And he said, no, I got a system for that. And I realized for me to function, the studio is super organized. My files are super organized, not because I'm a particularly organized person, but because if it's not, I'll just stare at the screen. Some people can work on a laptop that has like every JPEG that they've ever downloaded in the history of that relationship with the computer, and it doesn't faze them. They can just
You mean like sitting
work
on the desktop looking at them?
Oh yeah, the desktop is just like a clusterfuck of .jpgs.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it. I would go out of my mind. I would just clap the laptop shut and go and pour myself Manhattan. So I kind of have to figure workarounds for myself, and the organization is a big component of that. Everything's a certain color. I have sort of systems in place with like how stuff gets titled, so that when I import from my mix temp or from my tracking template to my mix template, it's a match tracks situation.
Mm-hmm.
My kick, for example, is always labeled kick space dash, because sometimes I'll import somebody else's file that says kick, and I don't want the computer to confuse it with my kick.
I'm too lazy to put the letter C in kick. I just put KIK.
That's the Lord Algie way, right?
I don't know.
They're
what
foot.
I always did.
They're foot. I know. They have a weird name for kick. I think it's foot.
Foot. There you go.
But yeah, like just things that make sense to me, so that when it's time to work, I don't have to think about, like, guitars are obviously green. And so what if I'm, scrolling through a screen, I don't have to like spend any time wondering where my guitars are. It's right in front of me.
What are the other colors, for instance? So guitars are green because of the letter G, and bass is brown. I always make my bass brown, but I didn't realize it was because of the letter B.
I do too, and I don't know why I do, but it just always seemed like that color.
What are drums?
My left to right goes acoustic kit, percussion, and then programming any like robot drums that are in there. And so to me, it's just the first colors of the Pro Tools color palette, where it's the top left is blue, the next one down is percussion.
That's a clever
is the
way
next
to do
one.
it. Make the colors match the left to rightness.
My master section's red. My time-based stuff's all yellow. It's interesting these days because like there's been such a democratization of that kind of info. You can download Andrew Shep's mix template or whatever. And like over the last decade, I've definitely just like hijacked various things that worked for me.
Yeah.
And I think we've all kind of done that. And sometimes I'll open somebody's session and be like, oh, you saw that mix with the Masters episode too. Cool.
That's awesome. All right. Well, so let me go to the our final question here. This is the hypothetical question I love to ask all my guests. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you get to go back and find young Steven. Yeah, I guess this is a little after you discovered guitar, because otherwise you'd be like, what's a guitar? But you go back and find young Steven and you say, listen, dude, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you like to go back and give yourself if you could?
If it's taking a long time, it doesn't mean you're heading the wrong direction.
Awesome.
Yeah. I think I wanted things to be quicker. I wanted to know how to make the drums sound like I heard them in my head faster. I wanted my career to have made me more money than it had made me faster than it did. Mm-hmm. It just takes time. You have to develop your taste. There's a million moving pieces that are all, happening all at once. And it takes a long time to get your head around that.
Now, you also, part of that for you was having to pack up shop and move to a new reservation. I guess that was an Arizona reference too. But, with moving your studio around from place to place, what would you say to somebody who's in the beginning of that journey? Would you say, don't do that? Or would that be part of it too? Like, it's okay if that's also part of your journey, if it has to be.
Yeah, there's just so much stuff that you can't predict. I mean, life is pretty chaotic, even if you kind of try to set things up so that it's not. Stuff just happens, and you kind of have to be able to bend. And I wouldn't, like, if I was starting right now, right now I already own all the stuff that's the infrastructure for a studio, but
Right.
I don't know if I'd necessarily pursue that now if I was starting from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
There is a convenience to it. It's fun. I'm really grateful to have that, but there's also so much that can be done with a really good interface and 2 mics and do your big stuff in a big room. There's whatever makes sense for folks financially so that you're not having to make decisions based solely on money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, because if all you're doing, like when the big room that I had previously, by the time I was done, I felt like a property manager because I was so stressed trying to keep both rooms full.
Yeah.
It was like this vacant time in my life where I was like, oh, I really wasn't very creative during this time. And I was making all decisions based around how to keep the lights on. And now my overhead is really low. And I'm able to make decisions based on am I the right person for this project? Are they the right project for this studio? And that's a really sustainable place to be, because if you're in it for the long haul, you're going to have to figure out a way to, stay in love with it for decades and decades.
Yeah, you have to be, if you're in it for the long haul, you have to be in it for the long haul.
Indeed.
So I will express gratitude retroactively for all the people that got a chance to come in and make music in your big studio while you were behind the scenes stressing out about keeping the lights on for them so that they could do that. Because I'm sure it was a gift to a lot of people to make a lot of music.
I hope so. I think it was. I'm grateful for the time, and it also informed how I wanted to move forward. Sometimes it's important to know what you don't want to do again, just as it's important to know what you want to do.
Absolutely. Well, Steven, thank you so much for joining us in Recording Studio Rockstars. You are a great interviewee for this podcast. So really, really fun talking to you, man. I like your style a whole lot. Let the rock stars know, where can they go if they want to learn more about you? What if they got a mix project they're ready to kick off? Or what if they're, in the vicinity and want to just come in and make a record, or thinking about a road trip?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only social media I have is Instagram, and that's just Saint Cecilia Studios, saintceciliastudios.com. And there's a contact section on that website that they can hit me up.
Awesome. This is the Cecelia that won't break your heart, rock stars. Sorry, a little Paul.
No guarantees. No guarantees.
No guarantees. Well, dude, thanks so much, rock stars. Thanks for listening to the show. And Steven, I look forward to meeting you in person, man. Oh, did we already meet? Is that how we met, or did we do it virtually? I forgot already.
We had a drink with some friends in NAMM.
Oh, that's right. I just saw you. Awesome.
Cheesecake Factory.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That's when it was. That was great. That was perfect, man. Well, it was great to have you on the show, and that's why I enjoy doing what I do, because I've got the memory of a goldfish, and I get to relearn it all over again next week on the next episode. Great to see you, dude.
Thanks, Rich.
All right, man. Talk to you soon. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible: Grace Design, Atom Audio, Native Instruments, and Isotope. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes, because it's a great way to help support this show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Liz Hulitskaya. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.